Welcome to Adoption Roundtable, a place to encounter the latest adoption research, policy, and practice in an accessible way. This is a space for adoptees, adoptive families, birth families, and adoption professionals. I'm Dr. Emily Helder, a clinical psychologist, researcher, and professor at Calvin University. I am also the co-editor of the Rutledge Handbook of Adoption, along with Dr. Alicia Marr and Dr. Gretchen Robel. In Season 1 of Adoption Roundtable, we'll be having conversations with the authors of chapters in the Handbook of Adoption. They are top international scholars in a diversity of fields, and together we'll talk about their work and what it means for understanding adoption. Hello, I'm Dr. Emily Helder, and I'm here with Dr. Hanna Raaska, who is the chief physician at the Pediatric Neuropsychiatric Unit at Helsinki University Hospital in Finland. She's also the member of the Finnish Adoption Study Group, which is conducting longitudinal research with international adoptees. And she and her team co-wrote a chapter in the handbook entitled Behavioral and Emotional Adjustment in Adoptees. So thanks so much for being here with me. Can you give me an overview of the Finnish adoption study? What are the goals and what's your role in the project?
Okay, this Finnish adoption studies, it began at 2007. The principal investigators, Helena Lapinleimu and Jari Sinkkonen, they noticed that there is very little knowledge about Finnish adoptees. And so they began a big survey study, big in Finnish scales. And the aim was to find what kind of physical or psychological problems Finnish adoptees have, where do they come from, what is their health, are there any factors that are associated with adaptation to the new family and environment. So later on we noticed that there are, of course, the limitations with the survey study, so we began a follow-up study, which is the longitudinal study you mentioned. And the aim of this study is to find measure or hallmark by which we could recognize those children who have the largest probability for problems later in their life. And we also try to measure stress of these adopted children. Also, in this longitudinal study, we want to study the velocity of catch-up growth and which environmental factors affect on it. We want to see what kind of neurological diseases Finnish adopted children have. And also we would like to develop a Finnish measure which helps to recognize language problems in adopted children. So I myself began as a doctoral student in this group, and after my thesis I have continued in this group as a postdoc researcher, and also I'm representing the child psychiatric point of view in this group nowadays.
Yeah, what a comprehensive set of assessments and goals. I would think that's really valuable to be able to see connections between the different facets of development.
Yeah, that's very, very important and interesting also.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in turning to the chapter that you and your team wrote, it really begins with talking about the role of attachment. And I'd love to ask you a bit more about how is it that attachment is related to behavioral and emotional outcomes? What's the connection there?
Yes, that is quite a tricky question, but I'm I could be all the day talking about this issue.
Yes.
But attachment is defined as a child's tendency to seek proximity and conduct when the child is in stress. And there are a number of studies, a lot of studies which indicate that more securely attached children are better able to regulate their emotions. And how this is the basis of this, these connections, I think, as we know, children learn through their experiences with their caregivers how to cope with negative emotions, especially in situations of distress and danger. And when that is repeated day by day, this learning process reinforces child's own emotion regulation. And what is the biological factor which connects these two? I think we need a lot of more research in that field. But I myself think that one factor may be the stress and stress hormones and stress reactions. And that is why we have also included in Finado study some stress markers in our study. We have highlighted the attachment issue because the children with insecure attachment styles, they are known to have more behavioral and emotional problems later in their life. Mm-hmm. I think if that is enough.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you too, one of the things I see clinically, and I'm sure you do as well, is that two children might have very similar early experiences prior to adoption, early adversity, but have very different outcomes when it comes to behavioral and emotional outcomes. So I wondered if you could say a bit about what might be behind that. You know, why would one child with the same experiences really experience a lot of resilience and recovery, and another one really experience a lot of challenges?
Yes. First of all, I think that we must bear in mind that there are a number of similarities in adopted children's background. For example, all children have had to separate from their birth mothers and have had more separations from their primary caregivers. But there are also many differences in their backgrounds, and those differences, they may be very difficult to evaluate afterwards. And I myself, as a clinician, I think it's very important to bear in mind that adopted children can't be taken as one homogeneous group. I think every child has to be evaluated individually, and bearing in mind that something that seems to be similar, there may be many differences also. Mm-hmm. Also in those experiences. We know that the period of pregnancy is important for later for the development of central nervous system, malnutrition, predisposition to drugs, maternal stress, which we know that are very difficult to detect afterwards. They all affect the developing brain system. We are also all the time getting more information and knowledge about the crucial role of early environment, and there are a number of differences in that as well. The malnutrition, exposure to infections, lack of care or maltreatment, they may differ a lot between children and may be difficult to evaluate afterwards. And also the time of exposure to these risk factors, it's crucial. And finally, last but not least, I think a very important thing are the genetic factors. And we are all the time getting more knowledge about those things, especially the genetic factors which are related to stress regulation. They seem to be important. Mm-hmm. and all these things, they are under research all the time, and I think in future we know much more about these things.
Yeah, because the key, if we could identify which kids were at higher risk because of those factors that you outlined, then we could really target intervention resources that way.
Yeah, that's true. But I think as clinician, as I began, I think that main issue is that we have to take all the child individually, and despite the common things, I think individual evaluation is what we have to base on.
Yes, that's best. Yeah. The next section of your chapter talks a bit about mediating factors, so things that link the early adversity that these kids might face with some of the later outcomes. And I wondered if you could say more about how these mediating factors help us understand why early neglect or abuse impacts later outcomes.
Yes, all these factors I explained earlier, they affect our developing brain and the brain connections and networks, and we know that the neural basis, for example, our behavior, our emotional style, executive functions, they lay on those neural networks, and I think that those basic functions, they affect our behavioral, emotional style, and of course that affects our adjustment. But of course, the factors that happen after adoption, the family, the good care child get, it has impact, and that is exactly what we want to know in this FINADO study about Finnish adopted children, that what are the factors, how we could promote those positive factors.
Yeah, those buffering kinds of things.
Yeah.
So another thing that I see clinically that families ask quite a bit about are kids will exhibit really good behavioral and emotional adjustment early in life. And then really sometimes when they enter adolescence or early adulthood is when they might start showing some difficulties. Do you have some explanations as to why that pattern might happen, but yet still be related to the early adversity that kids might have experienced before adoption?
I think there is some research also about this issue, that in adolescence, child has increasing need to understand his or her biological background and identity, and also in that age you need more to belong to the age group of children, and I think differing ethnicity may cause some problems, and of course, unfortunately, some children have experiences of racistic bullying in their background. I think that might be one explanation.
I would love more research in that area as well, because I think families have a lot of questions as to that. Yeah, so
yes, that's true.
Yeah, your chapter ends with some very practical information for providers, for families. So I really want to highlight ways that you've suggested fostering that positive adjustment. And I wondered if you had some advice that you tend to give to families who are really seeking to promote resilience in their kids and positive adjustment for them.
Okay, I think first of all, we have to bear in mind that most of adopted children are just well and don't ever have any psychiatric problems. I think that is something we must not forget. Yes. And also we have to bear in mind that most adoptive parents have good abilities to promote their child's secure attachment and positive development and adjustment. And I think if everything is going well, I think that's fine and nothing else has to be done.
Sure.
But if there are, as we know that there are a number of risk factors in the child's background, I think if parents have any concerns, so I advise to seek professional help, because there are a number of interventions programs that can promote positive outcomes. But I think that is something that it's good to have some professional aid, because I think it's difficult for a parent to do that all themselves. Mm-hmm. I think there are a number of professionals who can help. I think it's important to recognize the developmental problems, if there are some in early childhood, so that they could be recognized and child could get help for those problems. For example, if a child has language problems, it's very crucial to give rehabilitation and help for that development, so that it won't make more difficulties in the adjustment process. Mm-hmm. And I recommend every child to have a proper medical examination quite soon after adoption, so that any medical conditions which need to be treated would be recognized, and all those things that we can take care of should be recognized early enough and give child proper treatment for them. But for very practically, I would say to parents that get to know your child, give yourself and your child give time, be patient, and try to get to know your child, and try to understand his reactions and behaviors and what might be behind them, where they arise from. Some practical ideas to avoid misunderstandings, especially in the beginning, before the child gets language abilities. I have seen that many parents and children get help from visual aid or drawings and pictures to clarify the situations and what parents and child himself wants to tell when they have no common words. And of course, structuring situations, giving clear and so short instructions, I think they help all the children. Mm-hmm. And especially for older children, if the child needs aid for social situations, I think you must give child help. If the child can cope with one child at a time, don't take him or her into a bigger group, or give them help how to cope in the group. Mm-hmm. And I think emotion regulation and emotion recognition can be helped every day by explaining the concrete situations and emotions, and that may be beneficial for many children. But I would like to say, at last but not least, I would say what is important for me, try to find moments when you both enjoy being together. It might be taking a bicycling trip somewhere or whatever, but I think the shared joy is very important, to have joyous moments together.
Yeah, it probably forms the basis for being able to work through the harder times if you have some of those positive experiences, both for the child and the parent.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing your research and your perspective, and to your team for writing the chapter.
Thank you.
There's a lot of valuable information in there. Thanks for joining us at Adoption Roundtable. Please subscribe wherever you access your podcasts. We love to hear from you and have conversations about your reactions, questions, and experiences. We'd especially appreciate feedback if you have topics or questions that we could address in future episodes. You can find me on Facebook at helder.emily and at my website, emilyhelder.com. There you can sign up for my newsletter for the latest on adoption research and practice. Thanks for joining us.